The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Riverside Memorial Chapel as Margaret Whitfield stood beside her husband's casket, her trembling hands clutching a tissue that had long since become useless. David had been gone for 3 days now, and the reality still felt impossible to accept. The man who had brought her coffee every morning for 22 years, who had held her through every storm of their marriage, was now lying motionless in polished mahogany, while strangers offered condolences she barely heard. Have you ever dealt with difficult in-laws during grief? Comment where you're watching from and share your experience with family dynamics during loss. The receiving line seemed endless. Colleagues from David's accounting firm shook her hand with practiced sympathy. Neighbors from their quiet suburban street embraced her with genuine warmth. But Margaret's attention kept drifting to the imposing figure holding court near the flower arrangements. Eleanor Whitfield commanded attention without effort, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the circumstances, her black designer dress making a statement about both wealth and mourning. David's mother had always possessed an ability to make any room feel smaller simply by entering it. Margaret watched as Eleanor accepted condolences like a queen receiving tribute. She nodded graciously at each visitor, her voice carrying just the right mixture of grief and dignity. Yet something in Eleanor's demeanor felt performative, as if she were orchestrating the entire event rather than mourning her son. The older woman's steel gray eyes occasionally swept across the room, cataloging every detail, every person, every flower arrangement with the precision of a general surveying a battlefield. As the afternoon reception began to wind down, Margaret found herself alone near the memory table they had assembled with photos spanning David's life. Pictures of his childhood, their wedding day, family vacations, and quiet moments at home created a timeline of love and loss. She touched the frame containing their last photo together, taken just 2 months ago at their anniversary dinner. David's smile seemed to mock the present circumstances, so alive and vibrant in stark contrast to the grief weighing down every breath she took. Eleanor's footsteps clicked against the hardwood floor with military precision as she approached. Margaret sensed her presence before seeing her, the way prey instinctively recognizes a predator. The older woman positioned herself directly in Margaret's line of sight, her posture radiating authority and purpose. Her pearl necklace caught the soft chapel lighting, each lustrous bead seeming to emphasize the wealth and status she wore like armor. Eleanor began without preamble, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. Margaret, we need to discuss some important family matters now that the service is concluded. There are certain items in your possession that rightfully belong to the Whitfield family, and I believe it's appropriate to address this situation promptly. Margaret looked up from the photograph, confusion clouding her grief-stricken features. She struggled to process Eleanor's words, her mind still trapped in the fog of loss that had enveloped her since David's sudden heart attack. I'm sorry, what items are you referring to? Everything David and I own together is legally mine under our will and state law. The grandmother's jewelry collection, Eleanor stated flatly, her tone suggesting the matter was beyond dispute. The pearl set, the diamond bracelet, the emerald earrings, and particularly the antique ruby necklace that belonged to David's great-grandmother Victoria. These pieces have been in our family for generations, and they must remain with blood relatives. You understand, I'm sure, that such heirlooms cannot be allowed to leave the family line. Margaret felt the words hit her like physical blows. The jewelry Eleanor described represented some of her most treasured possessions, pieces David had gifted her over the years for anniversaries, birthdays, and special occasions. Each item held profound sentimental value, connected to memories of their life together. The ruby necklace had been David's wedding gift to her, presented the morning of their ceremony as something borrowed from family tradition. David gave those pieces to me, Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the chapel's ambient sounds. He said they belonged to me now, that I should wear them and cherish them as symbols of our union and his family's acceptance of me. I've worn them to every important event in our marriage. Eleanor's expression hardened into something resembling carved marble. Her lips pressed into a thin line that erased any pretense of familial warmth. David may have been generous with items that weren't truly his to give. The jewelry represents our family's heritage, our history, our bloodline. You've had the privilege of wearing these pieces during your marriage, but surely you understand that such valuable heirlooms must return to their proper place within the family structure. Margaret's cousins Linda and Patricia approached hesitantly, sensing tension but uncertain how to intervene. Eleanor acknowledged them with a polite nod before continuing her argument with renewed intensity. She gestured toward the assembled family members who remained in the chapel, using their presence as validation for her position. I've discussed this matter with David's aunts and uncles, Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength from perceived family support. We're all in agreement that the jewelry should be preserved within our bloodline for future generations. It would be selfish and inappropriate for you to retain items of such historical significance when there are legitimate heirs who will carry forward the Whitfield name and traditions. Margaret felt the room spinning slightly as grief combined with shock and confusion. She had never questioned her right to possess the jewelry David had given her. Each piece had become part of her identity as his wife, symbols of their love and commitment. The thought of surrendering them felt like losing David all over again, erasing tangible connections to their shared life. But those pieces mean everything to me, Margaret protested weakly, her voice breaking with emotion. David said his grandmother would have wanted me to have them. He told me stories about each piece, about the occasions when his grandmother wore them. They helped me feel connected to him, to your family's history. Eleanor's patience appeared to evaporate completely. Her voice took on a tone of barely controlled irritation, as if explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow child. Your feelings, while understandable, cannot override legal and moral obligations to preserve family heritage. These items have monetary value that extends far beyond sentimental attachment. They represent investments made by previous generations for the benefit of their descendants, not temporary marriages. The phrase temporary marriages hung in the air like a physical presence. Margaret realized that Eleanor had never truly accepted her as David's wife, had never considered their union anything more than an interruption in the family's narrative. 22 years of holidays, celebrations, and shared experiences had apparently made no impression on the older woman's calculation of who belonged in the family circle. Margaret's Aunt Rosalind approached the group, her own grief evident, but her protective instincts clearly activated by the confrontation she witnessed. She placed a supportive hand on Margaret's shoulder while eyeing Eleanor with poorly concealed suspicion. The chapel had grown quiet except for the rain continuing its steady percussion against the windows. Eleanor seized the moment to present her ultimatum with theatrical precision. I'm giving you 48 hours to gather the jewelry and arrange for its return to the family. This should provide sufficient time for you to locate each piece and prepare them for transfer. I've already spoken with my attorney about the proper legal procedures for reclaiming family heirlooms that were improperly distributed. Margaret stared at Eleanor in disbelief, struggling to comprehend how quickly her world had shifted from grief to legal threats. The woman who had raised David, who had supposedly loved him, was now treating his widow as an adversary to be defeated rather than a daughter to be comforted. The chapel's warm lighting seemed to dim as Margaret realized she was facing a battle she was completely unprepared to fight. If you choose to be difficult about this matter, Eleanor added with ominous calm, I will be forced to pursue more formal legal remedies. I have documentation regarding the jewelry's provenance and its rightful ownership within our family structure. It would be far better for everyone involved if we could resolve this matter quietly and amicably. Margaret felt tears beginning to flow again, but these were different from the grief she had been experiencing. These tears carried anger, betrayal, and a deep sense of violation. She looked around the chapel at David's relatives, searching for support or understanding, but found only averted gazes and uncomfortable silence. The family that had welcomed her at holiday gatherings and celebrated her anniversaries now seemed to view her as an outsider who had overstayed her welcome. Eleanor delivered her final statement with the certainty of someone who had never been successfully challenged. You have until Thursday evening to comply with this request. I suggest you use this time wisely to consider what David would have wanted regarding our family's precious heirlooms. I'm confident that when you think clearly about this situation, you'll recognize the appropriateness of my request. With that declaration, Eleanor turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the floor with military precision. She moved toward David's aunts and uncles, immediately engaging them in conversation that seemed designed to reinforce her position and isolate Margaret further. The widow stood alone beside her husband's memory table, surrounded by photographs of their life together, while the jewelry she treasured hung around her neck and wrists like evidence in a case she didn't understand she was losing. Margaret touched the ruby necklace David had given her on their wedding day, feeling its familiar weight against her chest. In 48 hours, Eleanor expected her to surrender not just jewelry, but the tangible memories that connected her to the only family she had known for more than 2 decades. The rain continued falling outside, matching the storm beginning to gather in Margaret's broken heart as she realized that losing David might only be the beginning of her losses. Margaret spent the following morning in David's home office, surrounded by the controlled chaos of 20 years of shared paperwork. Bank statements mixed with insurance policies, while old tax returns created small mountains across the mahogany desk David had inherited from his father. She moved through the familiar space like a sleepwalker, touching objects that still carried his presence. His coffee mug sat unwashed beside the computer. His reading glasses lay folded across a half-finished crossword puzzle. The normalcy of these details made his absence feel even more surreal. The doorbell's sharp chime cut through the morning quiet at precisely 9 o'clock. Margaret glanced through the front window and felt her stomach drop. Eleanor stood on the porch flanked by David's Uncle Vernon and Aunt Constance, while his cousin Bradley carried what appeared to be several empty moving boxes. The delegation looked official and intimidating, dressed in dark clothing that suggested they were continuing yesterday's funeral formality. Margaret opened the door with trembling hands, her grief-stricken appearance contrasting sharply with the group's businesslike demeanor. Eleanor surveyed Margaret's rumpled nightgown and uncombed hair with obvious disapproval before stepping into the foyer without invitation. The others followed in formation, transforming the entryway into something resembling a hostile occupation. "We're here to expedite yesterday's discussion," Eleanor announced, gesturing toward the boxes Bradley placed near the stairs. "I've brought family witnesses to ensure everything is handled properly and documented thoroughly. Vernon has experience with estate matters, and Constance helped catalog our grandmother's belongings when she passed. We want this process to be transparent and legally sound." Margaret backed toward the living room, feeling cornered in her own home. She gestured weakly toward the furniture, offering seats that no one accepted. The group remained standing, their posture suggesting they were here for business rather than comfort or condolence. Eleanor's eyes swept the room methodically, cataloging visible items with the precision of an appraiser. "I think there may be some misunderstanding about the jewelry," Margaret began hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "David always told me those pieces belonged to me now. He said his grandmother had wanted them to go to his wife, that it was part of accepting me into the family." Eleanor's laugh held no warmth whatsoever. Her expression suggested Margaret had just demonstrated profound ignorance about basic family protocols. David was sentimental and generous to a fault, but sentiment cannot override generations of family tradition and legal ownership. "These pieces represent our heritage, our bloodline, our responsibility to future generations of Whitfields." Constance nodded vigorously, her silver hair catching the morning light streaming through the bay window. She carried herself with the authority of someone who had spent decades managing family affairs and social hierarchies. Her voice carried the same crisp certainty as Eleanor's when she joined the conversation. Constance added her perspective with rehearsed precision. Mother Whitfield always intended for these pieces to remain within the family's direct lineage. She spoke often about preserving them for her great-granddaughters, for young women who would carry forward the Whitfield name and traditions. These heirlooms were never meant to be dispersed to outside parties, regardless of marital circumstances. Vernon opened a leather portfolio and extracted several documents that rustled ominously in the quiet room. His appearance suggested someone accustomed to legal formalities and business negotiations. The papers he handled looked official and threatening, covered with legal terminology that Margaret couldn't decipher from across the room. Vernon explained the documentation with professional detachment. "I've prepared a complete inventory list based on family records and insurance documentation. Each piece is described in detail, including approximate values and historical significance. We need you to gather everything on this list so we can verify its presence and condition before arranging for proper storage and future distribution. Margaret felt panic rising in her chest as the reality of the situation crystallized. These people weren't making a request or opening a negotiation. They were executing a plan they had clearly developed in advance, treating her like an obstacle to be removed rather than a grieving family member deserving consideration. The organized nature of their approach suggested hours of preparation and discussion from which she had been completely excluded. "I need time to think about this," Margaret protested weakly, wrapping David's robe more tightly around her body. "Yesterday was the funeral. I've barely had time to process losing David, and now you're demanding I surrender everything that connects me to him. This feels wrong, like you're taking advantage of my grief." Eleanor's patience evaporated with visible irritation. Her voice took on the tone of someone explaining obvious concepts to a particularly stubborn child. "Time is exactly what we don't have. These pieces are extremely valuable and need to be properly secured and insured under family ownership. Every day they remain in uncertain custody represents potential risk to items that are irreplaceable." Bradley spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the casual entitlement of someone who had grown up expecting family wealth to eventually flow in his direction. "The family has discussed this extensively, and we're all in agreement about the appropriate course of action. It's really not fair to put everyone through prolonged legal proceedings when the right thing to do is so obvious." Margaret retreated toward David's office, seeking refuge in the space that still carried his presence most strongly. The assembled family members followed her movement with their eyes, maintaining their formation like hunters tracking wounded prey. She could feel their collective judgment, their assumption that she would ultimately comply with their demands because she lacked the strength or resources to resist. In David's office, Margaret's hands shook as she riffed through filing cabinets, searching for anything that might support her position. Insurance policies, warranty cards, and personal correspondence created a paper trail of their shared life. She pulled out folder after folder, desperate to find documentation that would prove David's gifts to her had been legitimate and legally binding. Hidden behind tax returns from 15 years ago, Margaret discovered a manila envelope marked personal in David's distinctive handwriting. The envelope contained documents she had never seen before, including what appeared to be insurance appraisals and authentication certificates for various pieces of jewelry. Her heart raced as she recognized descriptions of the pieces Eleanor was demanding. One document immediately caught her attention. An insurance appraisal dated 3 years after their marriage described the ruby necklace as inherited collection from maternal grandmother's estate. Margaret read the phrase repeatedly, her mind struggling to process its implications. David's maternal grandmother would have been his mother's mother, not the Whitfield family line Eleanor kept referencing. Another document referenced emerald earrings as family inheritance through female lineage, with a note indicating the pieces had been gifted to Margaret and Whitfield upon marriage integration. The formal language suggested legal significance beyond simple gift-giving. Margaret felt her pulse quickening as she realized these documents might contradict Eleanor's claims about family ownership and bloodline rights. Eleanor's voice carried from the living room with increasing impatience. "We really need to complete this process today, Margaret. I have appointments this afternoon, and Bradley needs to return these boxes to proper storage. Your cooperation would be appreciated by everyone involved in this unfortunate but necessary situation." Margaret clutched the insurance documents against her chest while her mind raced through possibilities and implications. If the jewelry had come through David's maternal line rather than the Whitfield family heritage Eleanor claimed, then the entire foundation of yesterday's ultimatum might be fraudulent. She wondered how many other family members knew the true origin of these pieces. The phone rang suddenly, startling everyone in the house. Margaret answered with hands that trembled from anxiety rather than grief. Her sister Rachel's concerned voice provided the first moment of comfort she had experienced since David's death. Rachel had called to check on Margaret's emotional state and offer practical help with funeral aftermath and estate matters. Rachel's training as a paralegal immediately activated when Margaret whispered a desperate summary of Eleanor's demands and the intimidating family delegation currently occupying her living room. The insurance documents Margaret had discovered prompted Rachel to ask pointed questions about legal representation and documentation review. Her professional experience with estate disputes made her instantly suspicious of Eleanor's rushed timeline and aggressive tactics. "You need to speak with an attorney before surrendering anything," Rachel advised firmly, her voice carrying enough volume for the family members to overhear. Estate jewelry given during marriage typically belongs to the surviving spouse unless specifically designated otherwise in legal documents. Don't let anyone pressure you into making decisions while you're still processing grief. Eleanor appeared in the office doorway with obvious displeasure at overhearing Rachel's advice. Her expression suggested someone who had encountered an unexpected complication in what should have been a simple procedure. The older woman's presence filled the doorframe like a storm cloud, radiating disapproval and barely controlled anger. Eleanor interrupted the phone conversation with characteristic directness. "Legal representation seems unnecessarily dramatic for what should be a straightforward family matter. We're talking about returning items to their rightful place, not engaging in estate warfare that will cost everyone time, money, and emotional energy that could be better spent honoring David's memory." Margaret ended the phone call with promises to contact Rachel later while feeling caught between competing loyalties and authorities. Eleanor's family delegation represented decades of tradition and social pressure. Rachel offered professional knowledge and protective instincts. The insurance documents in Margaret's hands suggested there might be facts about the jewelry's ownership that no one had previously revealed or investigated. Eleanor delivered her final ultimatum with theatrical precision, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You have until tomorrow evening to gather the jewelry and arrange for its return. If you choose to involve lawyers and create unnecessary complications, I will be forced to pursue formal legal remedies that could become quite expensive and emotionally draining for everyone involved." Bradley and Vernon began moving toward the front door while Constance gathered her purse and coat. Their coordinated departure suggested a military operation rather than a family discussion. Eleanor remained in the office doorway for an additional moment, her steel-gray eyes fixed on Margaret with unmistakable challenge. "I hope you'll consider what David would want in this situation," Eleanor added with false sweetness that felt more threatening than her previous directness. "He always respected family traditions and understood the importance of preserving our heritage for future generations. I'm confident he would encourage you to do the right thing." After the family delegation departed, Margaret sat alone in David's office clutching the insurance documents that might hold the key to everything. The ruby necklace hung around her neck, its familiar weight now feeling like evidence in a case she was only beginning to understand. Tomorrow evening seemed both impossibly far away and terrifyingly close as she realized she was facing a battle that would determine not just jewelry ownership, but her entire future relationship with David's family. Margaret spent the night pacing David's office, the insurance documents spread across his desk like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet solve. Rachel had provided the name of attorney Sarah Chun, a specialist in estate law who had successfully handled several complex inheritance disputes. The prospect of legal fees terrified Margaret, but the alternative of surrendering her most precious possessions to Eleanor's aggressive demands felt equally impossible to accept. At 8 in the morning, Margaret called Chin's office and explained her situation to a sympathetic receptionist who agreed to schedule an emergency consultation. The attorney could see her at 10 o'clock, giving Margaret barely enough time to shower, dress in something appropriate, and gather all the documentation she had discovered in David's files. She wore the ruby necklace and emerald earrings, partly for courage and partly as evidence of their emotional significance. Sarah Chin's office occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered sweeping views of the city where Margaret had built her life with David. The attorney appeared younger than Margaret had expected, perhaps 40 years old, with intelligent dark eyes and an immediate presence that suggested competence and determination. Her handshake conveyed strength and confidence that Margaret desperately needed to borrow. Chin listened to Margaret's story with professional attention, taking detailed notes while occasionally asking clarifying questions about timeline, family relationships, and the specific jewelry pieces in dispute. Her expression remained neutral during Margaret's emotional recounting of yesterday's confrontation, but her eyebrows raised slightly when Margaret produced the insurance documents from David's personal files. These appraisals are quite interesting, Chen observed, examining each document with the careful attention of someone trained to spot discrepancies and hidden meanings. The references to maternal grandmother's estate and female lineage inheritance suggest a completely different ownership history than what Eleanor Whitfield is claiming. Have you ever researched your own family's jewelry history? Margaret admitted she had never thought to investigate the piece's origins beyond David's explanations when he gifted them to her. Each piece had come with romantic stories about their significance and beauty, but David had never provided detailed historical documentation about previous ownership. The insurance papers represented the first time she had seen formal references to the jewelry's provenance and legal status. Chen reached for her phone and dialed an extension while Margaret waited nervously in the leather chair facing the attorney's imposing desk. The lawyer explained to someone named Marcus that she needed an emergency jewelry appraisal for a potential inheritance dispute, emphasizing the urgency of the situation and the complexity of competing ownership claims. "I'm calling in Marcus Rivera, one of the city's most respected jewelry appraisers," Chen explained after ending the call. "He specializes in antique pieces and has testified as an expert witness in numerous estate cases. If there's anything unusual about these pieces' origins or authenticity, Marcus will identify it within hours rather than weeks." Margaret felt a mixture of hope and terror as the implications of professional investigation began to crystallize. Part of her wanted to learn the truth about the jewelry's history, but another part feared discovering information that might complicate her emotional connection to pieces that represented her marriage and her identity as David's wife. The ruby necklace felt heavier around her neck as she contemplated its potential secrets. Chen continued examining the insurance documents while explaining her preliminary assessment of Margaret's legal position. "Based on these appraisals and the fact that David formally gifted these pieces to you during your marriage, Eleanor's claims appear legally questionable at best. Family tradition and bloodline arguments rarely override documented ownership transfers between spouses." The attorney's confidence provided Margaret's first moment of genuine relief since David's death. For the past 36 hours, she had felt completely powerless against Eleanor's authoritative demands and family pressure. The possibility that legal precedent and documentation might support her position offered hope that she wouldn't have to surrender the tangible connections to her husband and their shared life. However, Chen cautioned, "We need to be prepared for Eleanor to escalate this matter if she's determined to pursue her claims." Family disputes over valuable property can become extremely bitter and expensive, especially when emotional attachment combines with significant monetary value. Are you prepared for the possibility of extended litigation? Margaret considered the question while watching traffic flow through the streets 15 floors below. Her financial situation without David's income would be challenging but manageable. The cost of legal representation might strain her budget, but losing the jewelry would devastate her emotionally in ways that transcended monetary considerations. She had to at least try to protect what David had given her. Marcus Rivera arrived at the office within an hour, carrying a professional equipment case and radiating the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades evaluating precious objects. His graying beard and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an academic appearance that inspired immediate confidence in his expertise. He examined each piece of jewelry with magnifying equipment while Chun and Margaret watched anxiously. The emerald earrings received particular attention as Rivera studied their settings and stone cuts under specialized lighting. His expression grew increasingly intrigued as he discovered details invisible to untrained observation. The ruby necklace prompted similar intense examination, with Rivera photographing specific angles and markings that apparently held significance for determining authenticity and origin. After 45 minutes of methodical analysis, Rivera looked up from his equipment with an expression that suggested he had uncovered something remarkable. "These pieces are definitely authentic antiques, probably dating from the early 20th century based on their construction techniques and design elements. But there's something quite interesting about their maker's marks and provenance indicators." Rivera pointed to microscopic engravings on the necklace's clasp that Margaret had never noticed during years of wearing the piece. The maker's signature includes identifying marks that I can trace through historical records of jewelry craftsmen. This particular artisan worked primarily for wealthy families on the East Coast, including several prominent families whose records I've researched for previous authentication projects. Chen leaned forward with obvious interest as Rivera continued his explanation. The style and construction methods are consistent with pieces commissioned for the Bennington family of Boston, a prominent merchant family active in the luxury jewelry market during the 1920s and 30s. If I'm correct about this connection, these pieces might have belonged to Margaret's maternal relatives rather than David's family. Margaret felt the room spinning slightly as the implications of Rivera's discovery became clear. Her maternal grandmother had been Helen Bennington before marriage, a detail Margaret had always known but never connected to potential jewelry inheritance. The possibility that these precious pieces had actually come through her own family line rather than David's completely inverted Eleanor's arguments about bloodline ownership and family heritage. Rivera requested permission to contact colleagues who specialized in Bennington family genealogy and jewelry documentation. The verification process would require comparing his findings with historical records and estate documentation from Margaret's maternal relatives. If the connection proved accurate, it would establish Margaret's ownership through direct inheritance rather than spousal gift-giving. While Rivera made his phone calls, Chen explained the legal implications of proving maternal inheritance. If these pieces belonged to Margaret's family originally, then David had essentially been returning them to their rightful owner rather than gifting family heirlooms. Eleanor's entire legal argument would collapse because she would have no legitimate claim to jewelry that had never belonged to the Whitfield family bloodline. Margaret realized she needed to contact her mother's sister Vivian, the family historian who maintained extensive records of Bennington family heritage and possessions. Vivian lived in a retirement community in Florida, but remained sharp and well-informed about family matters. She had often mentioned jewelry and household items that had been dispersed among various relatives over the decades. Chen encouraged Margaret to gather as much family documentation as possible while they awaited Rivera's verification of the piece's origins. Birth certificates, marriage records, estate inventories, and family photographs might provide crucial evidence for establishing the jewelry's true ownership history. The attorney's excitement was palpable as she realized they might have stumbled onto a case with clear legal precedent in Margaret's favor. Meanwhile, Eleanor was undoubtedly preparing her own legal strategy based on assumptions about Whitfield family ownership that might prove completely unfounded. Margaret imagined the older woman consulting with attorneys and gathering family witnesses to support claims that had no basis in historical fact. The irony of Eleanor's aggressive confidence potentially backfiring provided Margaret's first moment of genuine hope since David's funeral. Rivera concluded his phone consultations with obvious satisfaction, confirming that his colleagues had located Bennington family records that included detailed inventories of jewelry distributed among Helen Bennington's descendants. The ruby necklace and emerald earrings appeared to match descriptions of pieces that had been given to Helen's daughter, Margaret's grandmother, who had then passed them to her own daughter before they eventually reached Margaret's mother. The documentation trail suggested that Margaret's mother had given these pieces to David with specific instructions that they be presented to Margaret as family inheritance disguised as wedding gifts. The romantic story about David's grandmother had been a loving fiction designed to make the jewelry feel like acceptance into his family, while actually returning Margaret to her own heritage. Chen immediately began preparing documentation to establish Margaret's ownership through maternal inheritance rather than spousal transfer. The legal strategy would focus on proving the jewelry's true provenance, while demonstrating that Eleanor had no legitimate claim to pieces that had never belonged to the Whitfield family. The case had transformed from a difficult estate dispute into what appeared to be a clear-cut matter of rightful ownership. Margaret left Chen's office wearing the jewelry that now represented not just her marriage to David, but her connection to generations of strong women in her own family line. The pieces felt different around her neck and ears, carrying new weight of family history and personal identity. Eleanor's Thursday evening deadline suddenly seemed less threatening and more like an opportunity to reveal the truth that would destroy the older woman's arrogant assumptions. That afternoon, Margaret called Vivian in Florida and explained the situation while her aunt searched through family records and photograph albums. Vivian's excitement was audible through the phone as she confirmed details about the jewelry's distribution among family members and its eventual path to Margaret through her mother's careful planning. The older woman promised to overnight copies of all relevant documentation. Eleanor, meanwhile, remained confident in her legal position as she consulted with family attorney Harold Pemberton about filing formal claims for the jewelry's return. Pemberton had handled Whitfield family legal matters for 2 decades and shared Eleanor's assumptions about the piece's ownership and Margaret's vulnerability as a grieving widow without strong legal representation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal not just the jewelry's true ownership, but the fundamental difference between Eleanor's entitled assumptions and Margaret's actual rights under both family heritage and legal precedent. Thursday evening's deadline was approaching, but Margaret no longer feared Eleanor's ultimatum. Instead, she looked forward to the moment when documented truth would shatter the older woman's elaborate fiction about bloodline ownership and family tradition. The courthouse steps gleamed with morning frost as Eleanor Whitfield ascended them like a general approaching a guaranteed victory. Her navy blue suit had been tailored to perfection, and her silver hair was arranged in a style that suggested both authority and respectability. Behind her walked an impressive delegation of Whitfield family members, including Vernon, Constance, Bradley, and 2 additional cousins who had driven in from neighboring states to support Eleanor's claim to the family jewelry. Harold Pemberton, the family's longtime attorney, carried a leather briefcase filled with documentation he believed would establish the Whitfield family's unassailable right to reclaim their ancestral heirlooms. Pemberton had handled estate matters for prominent families throughout the region for over 30 years, and his confidence in Eleanor's case was absolute. He had seen countless situations where grieving widows attempted to retain property that rightfully belonged to established family bloodlines. Inside the courthouse's marble-columned lobby, Eleanor held court among her supporters like a matriarch preparing to restore order to family affairs. Her voice carried the authoritative tone of someone who had never seriously doubted her own righteousness or questioned her entitlement to make decisions about family property. The assembled relatives nodded approvingly at her statements about preserving heritage and protecting valuable assets for future generations. Eleanor surveyed the courthouse's imposing architecture with satisfaction, believing that formal legal proceedings would validate her position and expose Margaret's emotional claims as legally meaningless. The older woman had dressed for the occasion with jewelry from her own collection, pieces that proclaimed her status and sophistication. Her pearl necklace and diamond bracelet created a deliberate contrast with the simple black dress and minimal accessories she expected Margaret to wear. At precisely 9:30, Margaret entered the courthouse lobby accompanied only by attorney Sarah Chun and looking every bit the overwhelmed widow Eleanor expected to encounter. Margaret's appearance suggested someone who had barely slept and was struggling to cope with both grief and legal pressure. Her simple gray suit and modest jewelry created the impression of vulnerability that Eleanor's strategy depended upon exploiting. Chun carried a single briefcase and maintained the composed demeanor of an attorney confident in her preparation, but Eleanor dismissed the younger lawyer as inexperienced and probably inadequate for complex estate litigation. Pemberton had assured Eleanor that most attorneys would advise clients to settle rather than pursue expensive legal battles against established family claims backed by decades of tradition and social standing. The hearing took place in Judge Patricia Morrison's courtroom, a wood-paneled chamber that radiated the weight of legal tradition and formal procedure. Morrison had earned a reputation for efficiency and no-nonsense decision-making during her 15 years on the bench. Her silver hair and stern expression suggested someone who had seen every variety of family dispute and possessed little patience for emotional manipulation or frivolous claims. Pemberton opened Eleanor's case with the confidence of someone presenting an obvious legal conclusion rather than a disputed matter requiring careful examination. His voice carried the practiced authority of decades spent arguing before judges who respected tradition and established precedent. He gestured toward Eleanor and her assembled family members as he outlined their position with theatrical precision. "Your Honor," Pemberton began, This case involves the straightforward matter of returning valuable family heirlooms to their rightful owners within the Whitfield bloodline. These pieces have been treasured within our client's family for multiple generations, representing not merely monetary value, but irreplaceable heritage that must be preserved for future descendants who will carry forward the family name and traditions. Eleanor nodded approvingly from the plaintiff's table while her family members arranged themselves in the gallery like a jury of peers confirming the righteousness of her cause. Vernon and Constance sat directly behind Eleanor, their presence intended to demonstrate family unity and shared commitment to protecting ancestral property. Bradley and the visiting cousins filled additional seats, creating an impression of overwhelming family consensus. Pemberton continued his opening statement by characterizing Margaret as a well-meaning but legally naive widow who had understandably formed emotional attachments to items that her late husband had temporarily shared with her during their marriage. He emphasized that David Whitfield's generous nature had led him to allow Margaret to wear family pieces without formally transferring ownership, creating confusion that needed clarification through proper legal channels. The jewelry in question, Pemberton explained, includes pieces that belong to David Whitfield's great-grandmother Victoria, a prominent member of local society whose estate was carefully managed to preserve family assets for succeeding generations. These heirlooms were never intended for distribution outside the bloodline, and their retention by non-family members violates both legal precedent and moral obligations to honor ancestral wishes. Margaret sat quietly beside Chun, appearing to shrink into her chair as Pemberton's confident presentation gained momentum. Eleanor observed Margaret's body language with satisfaction, interpreting her apparent distress as evidence of a weak legal position and inevitable surrender. The older woman had anticipated that formal courtroom proceedings would overwhelm Margaret's emotional resistance and force her to accept reality about family ownership rights. Judge Morrison listened to Pemberton's arguments with professional neutrality while taking notes that would inform her eventual decision. Her expression remained impassive as she processed claims about family heritage, bloodline preservation, and ancestral intentions. Morrison had presided over numerous estate disputes involving competing interpretations of ownership rights and family obligations. When Chun rose to present Margaret's response, her demeanor suggested quiet confidence rather than the defensive desperation Eleanor expected from someone fighting an obviously losing battle. The younger attorney moved with purposeful precision as she approached the judge's bench, carrying herself like someone who possessed information that would fundamentally alter the proceedings. Your Honor, Chun began, my client's position is quite straightforward. Margaret Whitfield legally owns every piece of jewelry that Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield is attempting to claim. These pieces were gifted to Margaret during her 2012 marriage to David Whitfield, and she possesses clear documentation establishing her rightful ownership through legitimate inheritance rather than temporary spousal sharing. Eleanor's expression shifted slightly as Chin's confident tone registered, but Pemberton maintained his relaxed posture beside her. The family attorney had encountered numerous opposing counsels who attempted to project confidence while possessing weak cases, and he assumed Chun was employing standard bluffing tactics to improve her negotiating position before inevitable settlement discussions. Chun continued her presentation by explaining that recent investigation had revealed significant discrepancies in Eleanor's claims about the jewelry's provenance and ownership history. She announced that expert testimony would demonstrate that the pieces in question had never belonged to the Whitfield family bloodline, making Eleanor's entire legal argument factually unfounded and legally irrelevant. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted perceptibly as Chin's words registered with everyone present. Eleanor leaned forward in her chair, while family members exchanged confused glances behind her. Pemberton's relaxed confidence began showing signs of strain as he realized Chin's presentation was not following expected patterns of defensive pleading and settlement preparation. Your Honor, Chin announced, I call Marcus Rivera as an expert witness to provide professional testimony about the jewelry's authentic provenance and ownership history. Mr. Rivera is a certified appraiser with 30 years of experience in antique jewelry authentication and has testified as an expert witness in over 50 estate cases involving disputed ownership claims. Rivera entered the courtroom carrying his professional equipment and radiating the quiet authority that had impressed Margaret and Chun during their office consultation. His academic appearance and measured movements suggested someone accustomed to providing crucial testimony in high-stakes legal proceedings. Eleanor watched his approach with growing unease as she realized the opposition had invested in professional expertise rather than relying on emotional appeals. Judge Morrison swore in Rivera while Eleanor whispered urgently to Pemberton about the unexpected direction of Margaret's defense strategy. The family attorney assured Eleanor that expert witnesses often failed to provide conclusive evidence in complex inheritance cases, but his confidence appeared less absolute than it had during opening statements. Rivera testified with clinical precision about his examination of the disputed jewelry pieces, describing his methodology and credentials in language designed for legal rather than commercial contexts. He explained his use of specialized equipment to identify makers' marks, construction techniques, and historical design elements that established authentic provenance rather than family mythology. Under Chin's questioning, Rivera revealed his discovery of microscopic engravings and maker signatures that definitively identified the jewelry's origins with the Bennington family craftsmen of Boston rather than any connection to Whitfield family heritage. His testimony included photographic evidence of markings invisible to casual observation but clearly visible under professional magnification equipment. The ruby necklace, Rivera explained, bears the distinctive signature of Edmund Carlisle, a master jeweler who worked exclusively for prominent Boston families during the 1920s and 30s. His client records, which I accessed through the Jewelry Heritage Foundation archives, show that this specific piece was commissioned by Robert Bennington as a wedding gift for his daughter Helen in 1926. Eleanor's face drained of color as Rivera's testimony continued, but Pemberton objected that family records from nearly a century ago could not be considered reliable evidence for contemporary ownership disputes. Judge Morrison overruled the objection and instructed Rivera to continue his expert testimony about the jewelry's documented history and provenance. Rivera presented additional evidence showing that the emerald earrings had been crafted by the same artisan for the Bennington family collection, with documentation proving their transfer through Helen Bennington's female descendants according to family tradition and estate planning. His testimony established a clear ownership trail that led directly to Margaret through her maternal grandmother and mother. The courtroom remained silent as Rivera explained that Helen Bennington had become Helen Morrison after marriage, making her Margaret's maternal great-grandmother. The jewelry had passed through 4 generations of women in Margaret's direct family line, eventually reaching Margaret's mother, who had specifically requested that the pieces be given to Margaret as a wedding gift disguised as acceptance into David's family. Eleanor attempted to interrupt Rivera's testimony, but Judge Morrison firmly instructed her to remain silent until given permission to speak. The older woman's composure cracked visibly as she realized that her confident assumptions about family ownership were being systematically dismantled by documented evidence rather than emotional appeals or family tradition. Chun presented additional documentation provided by Margaret's Aunt Vivian, including estate records, family photographs, and correspondence that established the jewelry's continuous ownership within the Bennington family line. The evidence created an unbroken chain of legitimate inheritance that completely excluded any possible Whitfield family claim to the disputed pieces. Pemberton requested a brief recess to consult with Eleanor about the unexpected evidence, but his client appeared too shocked to provide coherent input about legal strategy. The family members in the gallery whispered among themselves with obvious confusion and distress as they processed the revelation that their carefully planned legal action was based on completely false assumptions about ownership. When proceedings resumed, Rivera presented his final piece of evidence, a letter from Margaret's mother to David, written shortly before their wedding and recently discovered in David's personal papers. The letter explicitly explained the jewelry's true origins and requested that David present the pieces to Margaret as family inheritance rather than revealing their actual source, allowing Margaret to feel accepted into his family while actually receiving her own heritage. The letter's contents devastated Eleanor's remaining composure as she realized that David had known the jewelry's true ownership from the beginning of his marriage. Her son had participated in what she now understood was a loving deception designed to honor both family traditions simultaneously, while Eleanor had spent decades believing in fiction about Whitfield family heirlooms that had never existed. Judge Morrison studied the evidence presented by both sides while maintaining professional neutrality, but her questions to Pemberton revealed skepticism about Eleanor's claims in light of Rivera's expert testimony and documentary evidence. The older attorney struggled to respond effectively to challenges about his client's fundamental misunderstanding of the jewelry's origins and ownership history. Chun concluded Margaret's case by emphasizing that Eleanor had no legal standing to claim property that had never belonged to her family, regardless of her sincere belief in fictional ownership rights. The evidence established Margaret's legitimate ownership through direct inheritance rather than spousal transfer, making Eleanor's demands equivalent to attempting to steal property from its rightful owner. Eleanor's family members began leaving the courtroom as the implications of Chen's evidence became undeniable. Vernon and Constance exchanged embarrassed glances before quietly exiting, followed by Bradley and the visiting cousins who had traveled to support what they now realized was a completely unjustified legal action based on family mythology rather than historical fact. Judge Morrison announced that she would review all evidence presented by both parties before rendering her decision, but her tone suggested that Margaret's documented ownership through maternal inheritance had created an overwhelming legal advantage. Eleanor sat in stunned silence as she confronted the reality that her confident assumptions about family heritage had been exposed as elaborate fiction. Pemberton gathered his materials with obvious embarrassment while Eleanor remained motionless in her chair, staring at the jewelry around Margaret's neck with new understanding of its true significance. The pieces she had demanded as Whitfield family heirlooms actually represented Margaret's own ancestral heritage, making Eleanor's aggressive claims an attempted theft rather than righteous reclamation of family property. As the courtroom emptied, Margaret touched the ruby necklace that now carried even deeper meaning as a symbol of both her marriage to David and her connection to generations of strong women in her own family line. Eleanor's dramatic legal challenge had inadvertently revealed truths about family history that enhanced rather than threatened Margaret's rightful ownership of the precious pieces that connected her to both her past and her future. Judge Morrison returned to the bench after a 20-minute recess with an expression that left little doubt about her conclusions. Eleanor sat rigidly beside Harold Pemberton, her earlier confidence replaced by visible dread as she awaited formal judgment on what had begun as her supposedly straightforward reclamation of family property. The few remaining Whitfield family members occupied the back rows of the gallery, their earlier supportive presence now transformed into embarrassed observation of unfolding disaster. Margaret remained calm beside Sarah Chun, the ruby necklace and emerald earrings she wore now carrying the weight of vindicated ownership rather than disputed possession. The transformation in courtroom atmosphere was palpable as everyone present realized they were witnessing the complete collapse of Eleanor's legal position rather than the expected validation of her family authority. Judge Morrison began her ruling with deliberate precision, her voice carrying the authority of someone delivering judgment based on overwhelming evidence rather than competing interpretations. The documentation and expert testimony presented by Mrs. Margaret Whitfield establishes conclusively that the jewelry in question has belonged to her maternal family line for nearly 100 years, with no legitimate connection to the Whitfield family heritage claimed by the plaintiff. Eleanor's face flushed crimson as the judge continued explaining how Rivera's professional authentication had demolished every assumption underlying her legal action. The microscopic maker's marks, historical records, and family correspondence created an unbreakable chain of evidence proving Margaret's rightful ownership through direct inheritance rather than spousal transfer or family generosity. More troubling, Judge Morrison continued, the evidence suggests that Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield pursued these claims despite having access to information that should have revealed their fraudulent nature. Family attorney Harold Pemberton acknowledged during testimony that he had not independently verified the jewelry's provenance before filing legal action, relying instead on his client's assertions about family ownership. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Judge Morrison's criticism became increasingly pointed. Professional legal practice requires verification of fundamental claims before pursuing litigation, particularly when demanding valuable property from grieving widows. The failure to conduct basic research into ownership history represents questionable professional judgment that has wasted court resources and inflicted unnecessary emotional distress. Eleanor attempted to interrupt with protestations about her genuine belief in family ownership, but Judge Morrison firmly silenced her while continuing the judicial assessment. Whether Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield's claims were based on deliberate deception or willful ignorance of available evidence, the result has been an attempt to obtain property through fraudulent legal proceedings that borders on criminal behavior. The word criminal hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She had entered the courthouse expecting triumph and vindication, only to face judicial criticism that questioned both her honesty and her basic competence in family matters she had claimed to understand completely. The assembled family members behind her exchanged mortified glances as they realized their matriarch was being publicly accused of attempted theft rather than righteous heritage protection. Judge Morrison awarded complete ownership of all disputed jewelry to Margaret while ordering Eleanor to pay all legal fees and court costs associated with the frivolous litigation. The financial penalty struck Eleanor particularly hard because she had initiated the legal action expecting Margaret to bear the burden of expensive defense costs that would force settlement regardless of ownership rights. Furthermore, Judge Morrison announced, "This court is referring Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield's conduct to the State Bar Association for review of potential sanctions against her attorney Harold Pemberton." Legal professionals who fail to verify basic facts before pursuing property claims against vulnerable clients may face disciplinary action for inadequate representation and abuse of legal process. Pemberton's face went ashen as he realized his long legal career might face professional consequences because of Eleanor's aggressive demands and his own failure to conduct independent research. The respected family attorney who had expected a routine estate matter now confronted potential Bar Association review that could damage his reputation and client relationships throughout the legal community. Margaret spoke publicly for the first time during the proceedings when Judge Morrison invited her to address the court about the impact of Eleanor's fraudulent claims. Her voice remained steady despite the emotional weight of confronting the woman who had attempted to exploit her grief for personal gain through elaborate legal manipulation. "Your Honor," Margaret began, "Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield approached me at my husband's funeral to demand jewelry that she claimed belonged to her family. She gave me 48 hours to surrender pieces that represent not only my marriage to David, but my connection to 4 generations of women in my own family line. She exploited my grief to pursue property that was never hers to claim." Eleanor stared at the floor while Margaret continued describing how the older woman's aggressive demands had compounded the trauma of losing David by threatening to sever Margaret's connections to tangible memories of their life together. The ruby necklace David had given her as a wedding gift now carried additional meaning as a symbol of her great-grandmother Helen's love and her family's enduring strength. Judge Morrison observed Eleanor's reaction during Margaret's statement, noting the absence of remorse or acknowledgement of wrongdoing despite overwhelming evidence of her misconduct. The older woman appeared focused on her own humiliation rather than the damage she had inflicted on a grieving family member through false legal claims and emotional manipulation. Margaret concluded her statement by expressing hope that Eleanor would reflect on how grief and legal pressure had affected someone she supposedly considered family. The dignity Margaret maintained while describing Eleanor's cruelty created a stark contrast with the older woman's continuing inability to accept responsibility for her fraudulent behavior. The remaining Whitfield family members filed out of the courtroom in obvious embarrassment, their earlier confidence in Eleanor's righteousness replaced by mortification at being associated with attempted theft disguised as family tradition. Vernon and Constance avoided eye contact with Eleanor as they departed, their participation in her intimidation campaign now revealed as complicity in fraudulent property claims. Bradley approached Margaret hesitantly before leaving, offering a stammered apology for his role in Eleanor's aggressive tactics. His earlier entitlement to family wealth had evaporated in the face of documented evidence that the disputed jewelry had never belonged to his bloodline. making his participation in Eleanor's scheme an embarrassing display of greed rather than righteous heritage protection. Eleanor remained seated long after Judge Morrison departed and the courtroom emptied, staring at the jewelry around Margaret's neck with new understanding of its significance and her own devastating miscalculation. The pieces she had demanded as Whitfield family heirlooms actually represented generations of Margaret's ancestors, making Eleanor's confident claims an elaborate fiction based on complete ignorance of actual family history. Harold Pemberton gathered his materials while avoiding conversation with Eleanor, his professional relationship permanently damaged by her fraudulent claims and his own failure to verify basic facts before pursuing expensive litigation. The respected family attorney now faced potential Bar Association sanctions because of his client's aggressive demands and his inadequate research into ownership documentation. Margaret and Sarah Chun departed the courthouse together while Eleanor sat alone in the empty courtroom, contemplating the complete destruction of her reputation and family relationships. The woman who had entered the building expecting vindication and authority now confronted isolation and public humiliation as consequences of her fraudulent legal action. Outside the courthouse, Margaret felt overwhelming relief as she touched the jewelry that had been formally confirmed as her rightful property through both marriage and inheritance. The pieces around her neck and ears represented not just her love for David, but her connection to strong women throughout her family line who would preserve these treasures for future generations. Eleanor's legal challenge had inadvertently strengthened Margaret's understanding of her own heritage while exposing the older woman's attempted theft as morally bankrupt and legally fraudulent. The confident matriarch who had demanded immediate compliance with her ultimatum now faced financial penalties, professional embarrassment, and family ostracism as consequences of her elaborate deception. The ruby necklace caught afternoon sunlight as Margaret descended the courthouse steps, its familiar weight now carrying additional meaning as a symbol of justice served and truth revealed. Eleanor's aggressive campaign to exploit grief for personal gain had backfired completely, leaving the older woman isolated and disgraced, while Margaret's rightful ownership was permanently established through overwhelming documentary evidence. Margaret realized that David's loving gift had been even more meaningful than she had understood, representing not just his acceptance of her into his family, but his careful preservation of her own ancestral heritage disguised as romantic gesture. Eleanor's fraudulent claims had revealed truths about family history that enhanced rather than threatened Margaret's connections to both her marriage and her maternal lineage. 3 months after the courthouse victory, Margaret stood in her dining room arranging a display case that honored both her marriage to David and her newfound understanding of her maternal heritage. The ruby necklace and emerald earrings occupied places of honor alongside photographs of 4 generations of women who had treasured these pieces. Her great-grandmother Helen smiled from a sepia photograph, wearing the same necklace that now belonged to Margaret through legitimate inheritance rather than family mythology. The display included documentation from Marcus Rivera's authentication research, creating a visual timeline that traced the jewelry's journey through the Bennington family line. Margaret had framed the letter her mother had written to David, explaining the piece's true origins and her hope that Margaret would feel welcomed into his family while actually receiving her own heritage. The loving deception now felt like a gift that had connected her to both families simultaneously. Vernon and Constance had visited the previous week to offer formal apologies for their participation in Eleanor's fraudulent legal action. Their embarrassment was obvious as they acknowledged how quickly they had accepted Eleanor's claims without questioning her knowledge or conducting independent research. They brought flowers and expressed genuine remorse for the additional grief they had caused during Margaret's mourning period. Bradley had written a lengthy letter expressing his mortification at being involved in what the court had characterized as attempted theft disguised as family tradition. His earlier sense of entitlement to family wealth had been replaced by understanding that Eleanor's confident assertions about heritage and bloodlines had been elaborate fiction based on complete ignorance of actual ownership history. Even David's aunts and uncles from his father's side had reached out to rebuild relationships damaged by Eleanor's aggressive campaign. They explained that they had never questioned Eleanor's expertise in family matters, assuming her decades of managing Whitfield's social affairs qualified her to make decisions about ancestral property. The court's revelation of her fundamental ignorance had shocked family members who had respected her authority for years. Margaret's phone rang frequently with calls from relatives who wanted to reconnect and express support for her legal victory. The family isolation Eleanor had tried to create had backfired completely, with extended relatives now viewing Margaret as a victim of elder abuse rather than an opportunistic outsider attempting to steal family treasures. Her dignity during the legal proceedings had earned widespread admiration and sympathy. Eleanor, meanwhile, faced complete social ostracism within the community where she had once held considerable influence. The country club where she had been a prominent member for 30 years quietly suggested she might be more comfortable seeking social activities elsewhere. Her bridge group dissolved after members expressed discomfort associating with someone the court had accused of fraudulent legal conduct. Harold Pemberton's law firm had requested Eleanor find new legal representation after the State Bar Association launched an investigation into his failure to verify basic facts before pursuing expensive litigation against a grieving widow. The respected attorney's reputation suffered permanent damage because of his association with Eleanor's fraudulent claims and inadequate professional research. Eleanor's financial situation deteriorated rapidly as she struggled to pay the legal fees and court costs Judge Morrison had imposed as penalties for frivolous litigation. The expensive legal action she had initiated expecting Margaret to bear defense costs had instead created crushing debt that forced Eleanor to consider selling property to meet her court-ordered obligations. Margaret received updates about Eleanor's circumstances through family members who occasionally encountered the older woman in public settings. Reports described Eleanor as appearing diminished and isolated, her former confidence replaced by obvious awareness that her reputation had been permanently destroyed by her own fraudulent behavior and arrogant assumptions about family authority. The jewelry collection had been professionally appraised and insured under Margaret's name, with documentation establishing clear ownership that could never again be disputed by family members claiming fictional heritage rights. Margaret wore different pieces to various occasions, each time remembering both David's love and her connection to generations of strong women who had preserved these treasures. What would you have done in Margaret's situation? Let me know your thoughts on family loyalty versus justice in the comments below. Margaret had created a scholarship fund in David's memory, using part of the insurance settlement to help students pursuing accounting degrees at the local university where David had earned his professional credentials. The fund's announcement included mention of Margaret's successful defense of her inheritance rights, creating positive publicity that contrasted sharply with Eleanor's public disgrace. 6 months after the court proceedings, Margaret attended David's cousin's wedding wearing the complete jewelry collection for the first time since the legal dispute. Family members approached her throughout the reception to admire the pieces and express continued support for her victory over Eleanor's fraudulent claims. The ruby necklace sparkled under the reception hall lighting as Margaret danced with relatives who had welcomed her back into the family circle. Eleanor was notably absent from the wedding, her social exile from family events now complete and permanent. Family members mentioned that she had attempted to reconcile through written apologies, but her inability to acknowledge the serious harm she had caused made forgiveness impossible for most relatives who had witnessed her aggressive campaign against Margaret's grief. Margaret's final victory came when she received a formal letter from Eleanor's new attorney, requesting settlement discussions regarding potential reduction of the court-ordered financial penalties. The letter acknowledged Eleanor's financial distress and suggested that Margaret might consider showing mercy towards someone whose fraudulent behavior had been motivated by grief rather than deliberate malice. Margaret declined the settlement request through Sarah Chon, explaining that Eleanor needed to experience the full consequences of her fraudulent legal action to prevent similar behavior toward other vulnerable family members in the future. The older woman's attempt to exploit grief for personal gain deserved punishment that would deter future misconduct rather than mercy that might encourage continued manipulation. As Margaret locked away the jewelry each evening, she reflected on how Eleanor's aggressive demands had inadvertently led to discoveries about family heritage that enriched rather than threatened her connections to both David's memory and her own ancestral line. The pieces now carried deeper meaning as symbols of justice served and truth revealed through professional legal representation rather than intimidation and family pressure. Eleanor's confident assertion that family tradition and bloodline arguments would override documented ownership had proven spectacularly wrong, leaving the older woman isolated and financially ruined, while Margaret's rightful possession was permanently established through overwhelming evidence of legitimate inheritance spanning 4 generations of remarkable women.